I'm Adam.
Kia ora, I'm Eugene.
And this is Long Story Short, a podcast about crimes and catastrophes, scandals and scammers, secrets and lies, strange tales you've never heard of, and or surprising twists on stories you thought you knew.
So, Adam, there are some moments in life, aren't there, that time just seems to stand still, like the clock itself is suspended because it wants to know what's going to happen next. For me, one of those moments, it was an overcast Saturday afternoon, September 11 actually, but not that one. This one was 1999. Rather than New York, this scene was in Wellington at the High Court. It was packed to overflowing. There were people in the foyer, there were people outside, and the press bench where I was seated, it was jammed elbow poised over notebook to elbow poised over notebook. Like, everyone was there waiting. We'd had word that a verdict was about to be delivered, and this was one of Aotearoa, New Zealand's most sensational murder trials, a case which had drawn unprecedented coverage to that point. It was while we waited for the decision that it felt like time was standing still. The jury foreman was standing up, having been asked by the judge to deliver the verdict. No one but those 12 members of the jury knew which way it was going to go. There were 2 verdicts to be delivered, 2 charges of murder because this was a double homicide. But everyone knew that whichever way the jury went on the first charge, the second would follow. It made sense. And so the foreman had been asked, how do you find the defendant? And the first utterance from the foreman is, guilty. And then again, guilty. From the dock, the defendant stared at the jury and quietly said, you're wrong. He'd kept on saying he was innocent since he first came in for intense scrutiny from the police 20 months earlier, and he's never wavered from that stance since. At his sentencing a few weeks later, and I was there again, I remember this scene in court. The judge sent him to jail with a non-parole period of 17 years. His family members leapt from their seats, and the man himself yelled at the judge, "This is a bloody farce, I'm an innocent man." And then, not done, he swore at the judge and then said, "I hope you burn in hell."
He was angry.
He sure was.
And he really believed he'd been done wrong.
Yeah, he sure did. And that's a fight he's kept up ever since, right to this day. A fight he has continued, even taking to the Court of Appeal again in 2025, desperately trying to convince the system that there's been a miscarriage of justice.
So, yeah, this is a case that always comes up any time anyone talks about injustices or failings of the criminal courts in New Zealand. It's kind of divided the country for decades. Everyone's got an opinion. The police are certain they got their man. His supporters are convinced a man's behind bars for a double murder. He just didn't commit.
Let's take a deep dive, eh?
Why not? Especially since you were there for many of the big moments of the legal case that followed, Eugene, in the courtroom for the depositions hearing, for the trial, and then for the first appeal. So, like we said, this is Long Story Short, and this episode, we're looking at the case of Scott Watson and the murders of Olivia Hope and Ben Smart, who vanished from a party in the Marlborough Sounds on New Year's Eve, 1997, never to be seen again.
Adam, were you around at the time of the Sounds murders? I don't think you were you?
I was living in the UK at the time, though I had come home that Christmas, but I just don't believe I picked up a newspaper that entire summer. So, but it has been such a big story, and it's never gone away. So when I came back to New Zealand, to live in New Zealand a few, 4 or 5 years later, it's a story that's just come up again and again.
Yeah, it just never leaves the news, does it? And I covered the case extensively in the late 90s and early 2000s, sitting in court for, as you said, for nearly every single day the case was heard. I've also reported on it at various times over the years, which we'll explain later. But Adam, why don't you, as the sort of newbie to this case, if you like, give us a new listeners start here roundup to get us up to speed with the basics.
Right. So here's what I understand. In fact, let's make it simple. The Court of Appeal summed it up once in one of the appearances. So they do a good job of summing things up sometimes, these judges. So here it is. Olivia Hope, then aged 17, and her friend Ben Smart, then aged 21, attended the 1998 New Year's celebrations at Furneaux Lodge in the Marlborough Sounds. They were last seen boarding a yacht at the lodge anchorage in the early hours of the morning in the company of another man. He was said to have offered them a place to sleep. When there was none remaining aboard the yacht, Ms. Hope travelled thereon. Ms. Hope and Mr. Smart have not been seen since. Their bodies and possessions have never been located.
It's actually a really great summary. I guess it's sort of why the judges get paid the big bucks. But one thing, though, which is always a bit confusing with this story, 1998 New Year's celebrations. We said 1997 New Year's Eve earlier. So to clarify, they went missing in the early hours of January 1, 1998, after going to a party on December 31, 1997, New Year's Eve 1997 or New Year's 1988. I always get so mixed up.
Midnight is such a confusing concept, I guess.
It is.
Anyway,
Yeah.
those are the facts.
Yeah, and if only the rest of the case was that simple.
So the question has always been, as per that summary, who is the mystery man? And we're going to use that term quite a bit. So before we go any further, I want to be super clear that by quote-unquote mystery man, we always mean this guy who was last seen with Ben and Olivia in the early hours of January the 1st, 1998. And there's no real mystery over the final fate of Ben and Olivia. They're dead.
Yeah. There was never any suggestion they'd run away or anything like that. Well, not since very, very early on. The mystery has never been, where are they? The mystery is always, who is the mystery man? So, as we said at the top, the police were and remain convinced that they got their man. The guy they arrested and sent to trial. The guy who still to this day proclaims his innocence. His name is Scott Watson, and he was arrested on June 15, 1998. He was aged 26.
So he's 54-ish now.
Yeah. In relation to the case, we can say some things that are incontrovertible, such as during the afternoon of December 31, 1997, Scott Watson, who was from nearby Picton, sailed alone on his yacht, the Blade, to Endeavour Inlet in the Marlborough Sounds.
So Furneaux Lodge, which was prepared for a big turnout of boats, having become the New Year's party venue in the Marlborough Sounds, they told him to tie up his boat, the Blade. Actually, raft up is the nautical term. So it's,
Thank you, Captain Dudding.
Well, you're going to get these little nuggets all the way through. Next, I've sailed a, what are they called? Peakler, Optimist, something. Yeah. Anyway, whatever. The Blade, next to another yacht, which is called the Mina Cornelia, a little way out from the lodge's jetty. And then a third yacht, the Bianco, was on the other side of Mina Cornelia in this 3-boat parking arrangement.
Yeah, so you've got the Blade, the Mina Cornelia, and the Bianco all sort of hitched up together.
Strapped together.
Yeah. And they're in the bay out from Furneaux Lodge. Scott Watson didn't know the crew on the Mina Cornelia, but in the evening, he sort of hopped on board their boat and socialised before everyone headed ashore. When I say socialise, they gave evidence he was quite obnoxious. The more so, the more he drank.
So around 10 p.m, the skipper of the Mina Cornelia dropped his crew and Watson ashore for the party at Furneaux Lodge, which was going to be attended by about 1,500 people.
The people from the Mina Cornelia ditched Watson pretty quickly.
Evidently sick of him, I'm guessing.
Mm-hmm.
And Ben Smart and Olivia Hope were at that same party. But this is a big party. So
it's a big party.
Who meets who?
Yeah. And so inside this party, Scott Watson made quite the nuisance of himself, basically drinking and carrying on like a dickhead, being offensive and dropping terrible chat-up lines. Examples such as to a woman he was talking to who he'd asked the name of his boat, and he replied, anything you want it to be, sugar. So yeah, carrying on like a dickhead. I'm guessing he was not alone in this regard, by the way.
So at some stage, Scott Watson went back to the Blade.
He and his boat were gone by early morning, certainly by 7 a.m. None of those things are disputed, but what is hotly disputed is the central question. Was he this mystery man? But perhaps that's getting ahead of ourselves a little bit. Let's sort of set the scene a bit, Adam, and you love doing this, so take it away.
It's 1998. New Zealand had its first female Prime Minister, as Dame Jenny Shipley, from the National Party. This is also the summer that Auckland City Centre was hit by a series of kind of embarrassing power blackouts, which was a national scandal. Everyone had to have generators to stop their beer from getting warm. Internationally, Bill Clinton was the president of the US. Not sure exactly what he was up to in January that year, but this is the year, later this year, 1998, he would be impeached over his conduct towards Monica Lewinsky.
The song of that summer, which was no doubt played a few times that night at the New Year's Eve party Ben and Olivia went to, was Blur's Song 2. Although you might be like me and think, until I actually researched that the name of the song was Woohoo!
I know it now.
Yep.
Right. Look, this is an episode about a murder. And it turns out there are some really dark stories from this part of the country, which is at the top of Te Waipounamu, the South Island of Aotearoa, New Zealand. And there are some resonances. So we're going to do a teeny historical dive. So one of them is what happened around a place called Mohua, or Golden Bay. So this was the place that there was the first contact between Māori and Europeans in 1642. So Abel Tasman, guy who gave us the name of the Tasman Sea, the Dutch explorer, sailed into the bay, and he completely misunderstood the fact that the local people of Ngāti Tumata Kōkiri, to them, his ship and his crew would have been completely weird, probably quite frightening. And then he completely misread the signals that were the communications that went from here. At one point, the Māori toa, or warriors, they were blowing on what was probably a conch shell. So that's that big sort of booming sort of sound. Purpose of that, almost certainly, warning these foreigners off. But Tasman interpreted this all upside down and ordered his men to play musical tunes in return. Actually, I don't know what they would. Do they have hornpipes on? Anyway, they must have some musical instruments to play. And I know also in terms of first contact, it's kind of like, this is like the scene in Close Encounters where the aliens and the humans start playing do-do-do-do-do back to each other.
With Abel Tasman, the alien.
Yeah, precisely. Anyway, starts with a conch shell, but things ramp up. And eventually there's a confrontation and 4 of the European sailors are killed. And one of them is pulled aboard and taken back to shore. Abel Tasman gets the message and gets out of Dodge.
There's another encounter we should cover off because this one happened right within the Marlborough Sounds, really close to where Ben and Olivia went missing. And you might recognise some of the names that come up. So almost 130 years after Abel Tasman had skedaddled, another European explorer turned up, one you've probably heard of, Captain James Cook. And he arrived in the Sounds aboard his ship Endeavour on 16 January 1770 at a place now known as Meritoto Ship Cove. Ship Cove was what Cook called it, not his most imaginative name. He didn't really come up with imaginative names. Anyway, he described the place as a very snug cove and wrote, "The number of inhabitants hardly exceeds 300 or 400 people. They live dispersed along the shores in search of their daily bread, which is fish and fern roots."
And you can't see this because it's a podcast and you're looking at the script here, but there's some wild spellings in here, like fern with an I and live with some extra letters, and daily doesn't have an I in it. It's kind of cool. Anyway, Captain Cook couldn't spell like we do. Anyway, sorry.
Differently spelling. Anyway, I'm coming to the encounter, I promise. He came back to the area on his second voyage to these parts about 2.5 years later. That time there were 2 ships which had sailed in this sort of watery convoy, Cook commanding the Resolution and another vessel called the Adventure, which was commanded by Lieutenant Tobias Furneaux. The 2 ships met up at Ship Cove. The snugness of the place had obviously been appealing. Later on, when the Adventure was still in the area, Furneaux sent 10 men ashore at Wharehunga Bay to collect greens. When the men hadn't returned, 10 armed Marines from the Adventure went ashore to look for them. But what they found was not pleasant.
Historian Dame Anne Salmond described the scene in her book Between Two Worlds. Quote, "They saw about 20 food baskets tied up. When they cut these open, they found them packed with roasted meat and fern root, still warm from the fire. Bernie hoped that this might be dog's flesh, but soon they found more shoes and a hand tattooed TH. This was unmistakably the hand of Thomas Hill." He's one of the missing crew members, obviously. "Behind the beach, they saw a circle of freshly dug ground about 4 feet in diameter, almost certainly a hangi, or earth oven," end quote. So nearby, they found dogs chewing on entrails and other body parts. They collected some of them up, fired some parting shots, destroyed 3 waka, 3 canoes, and then hightailed it back to the Adventure. So there's been speculation about what led to the killings, and without victim blaming here, one of the murdered crew members had been involved in some previous raru, some trouble, attempting to kidnap some locals. So yeah, probably not popular with the tangata whenua, the people of the land. Well, anyway, you probably recognised a couple of names there, right? So the ship Endeavour, from when Cook first came through, and Lieutenant Tobias Furneaux. Because, as we've said, the party central to the Sounds murder case was at a place called Furneaux Lodge in Endeavour Inlet, within the Marlborough Sounds. And nowadays, arguably, the name Furneaux in particular is more associated with what happened in 1998 than back in 1772. So we thought it was worth just connecting that history.
Yeah. So a good history and geography lesson there. But let's get back to the case of this mystery man and how he came to be with Ben Smart and Olivia Hope. Actually, first, there is a bit more background that we should cover off. Who were Ben and Olivia, and how did they know each other? So, Ben Smart and Olivia Hope met at Furneaux Lodge, but it was actually the year before they disappeared at the 1996 New Year's Eve party. Or is that 1997? Here I go again.
New Year's Day, you're doing it again.
Yeah,
Maybe just don't say the words out loud.
True.
A year earlier.
Yeah, a year earlier. Ben was about 4 years older than Olivia. Like we said, they were 21 and 17 at the time of their deaths. He was from Bingham, which is near the Sounds, but had also lived in Saudi Arabia and the Maldives, both places his engineer father was posted for work. And he'd also lived in Christchurch, where he'd been to boarding school and polytechnic. He loved music and had a band called Exit. He told his dad that they'd given it that name because Exit was always up in lights. Pretty clever.
Awesome. Olivia loved music too. She was planning to study music and law at Otago University. Olivia was in the Marlborough Girls' College Choir, which did a tour of Japan and had passed a Trinity College of London performers exam for piano. So in 1996, that's the year before, remember, Ben went to the Furneaux party with some mates, and Olivia went to the same party with her older sister, Amelia, and their parents, Jan and Gerald Hope, had anchored their yacht in Endeavour Inlet and rowed the girls ashore. During that night, Olivia met up with Ben for the first time, and they began a bit of a fling, which lasted the summer. They'd go to movies together and things like that. The relationship ended when Ben went back to Christchurch for Polytech at the end of the summer, but they stayed friends. Olivia and Amelia were guests at Ben's 21st, so they'd kept up. So in 1997, so now this is the year of the murder, or the time of the murder, the Hope girls were among a group of friends who had chartered a yacht called the Tamarack, and they took it to Endeavour Inlet for New Year's. Ben had also returned for the party, but he was with friends staying at a batch just across the water from Furneaux Lodge. A batch, Kiwi term for a holiday home for our international listeners.
Or people from the South Island.
Oh yeah, they call it a...
Is it a manse? No.
No,
not a manse. Sorry.
a thing.
Yeah.
I can't remember.
Sorry, Dunedin friends.
So I was born in Christchurch. I'm technically a South Islander.
True.
What are they called, Connor? Anyway.
It'll
come to us. There were... Crib. There we
Well
go.
done.
There were about 1,500 partygoers at Furneaux Lodge that night, and lots of them had arrived on boats, 110 boats, which all moored in the inlet, and there's more to come about those boats, much more. But back to Ben and Olivia. During that night, each of them spent time with others, but as the party went on, they gravitated towards each other, and they were seen together on the jetty just after midnight. Around 1:30 a.m., witnesses saw them kissing in the garden, in the garden bar area. And soon after that, they headed back to the jetty, calling it a night, and heading off from the party to find somewhere to crash for the night, as many people were by that time.
And this is where things unravel for the couple. There's a series of events, any one of which you look back on and you think, what if? So at the jetty, Ben and Olivia met up with one of Olivia's friends, Kirsty, and the three of them planned to head out to Punga Cove, where Ben was staying at the batch with his mates. Now, getting out to Punga Cove was complicated by the fact that it was across the water, across the bay. But luckily, one of Ben's mates, Marco, was around and he had a speedboat. So, no worries, says Marco. He agrees to take them. Olivia and Kirsty want to get some clothes from the Tamarack. That's the boat they'd chartered. So Marco says, yep, I'll drop Olivia, Kirsty, and Ben at the Tamarack, go pick up some other people, then come back to the Tamarack, collect the trio, and then all of them can go to Ponga Cove, Ben's batch, for the night. Got it? Okay. So, unfortunately for the couple, after dropping off Ben, Olivia, and Kirsty at the Tamarack, Marco forgot to go back and pick them up and instead headed over to Ponga Cove without them. Ben, Olivia, and Kirsty, they hung around on the deck in the dark for about 45 minutes waiting for Marco, putting on life jackets to shrug off the cold. Eventually, it's becoming obvious, Olivia went below deck to find somewhere for them to sleep on the Tamarack. But she saw that it was already crowded. There were 9 paying passengers, but at least 14 people slept on board that night. Olivia got a bit stroppy, and she started arguing with some of the hangers-on, at one point saying, I've paid to be on this boat, and I want everyone who has not paid to be on the boat to go. Now, of course, she was trying to find a space for Ben, who had not paid, so he presumably kept quiet during this argument. Once back up on the deck, Olivia, Ben, and Kirsty figured their best option for somewhere to sleep was to head back to shore, and they started keeping an eye out for a ride. And this is where we encounter the mystery man. It's also the moment we first meet the key witness in this whole case. He's a water taxi driver called Guy Wallace. So Guy Wallace spent much of the night working in the bar at Furneaux Lodge. But right at the end of the night, he helped ferry partygoers out to their boats in Endeavour Inlet using a small inflatable boat with an outboard motor. It was a service that the lodge put on for these guests who'd come for this big party. Guy Wallace pulled up at the Tamarack, and on board the water taxi, he had Olivia's sister, Amelia, and a friend, Rick, and a few others. Amelia and Rick, they hop off the water taxi, and Ben and Olivia hop on the water taxi.
It would suggest that Amelia and Rick are okay with squeezing in, so there are 16 people sleeping rather than... Anyway.
Yeah, was there a conversation? Anyway, so Amelia and Rick hop off onto the Tamarack. Ben and Olivia get off the Tamarack onto the water taxi, seizing their chance to get back to shore. Kirsty, meanwhile, who had planned, of course, to join them to go back to shore, she'd turned around to stash her stuff, and in the few seconds it took to do that, the water taxi left without her. The last thing she heard from Olivia was a call across the water, "Where's Kirsty?" Now, I mentioned the mystery man. So he was on board the water taxi with Guy Wallace. Guy Wallace says, as he left the Tamarack and headed to the mystery man's yacht, the man started making creepy comments about Olivia. The mystery man offered the couple a place to stay on his yacht, and when the water taxi got there, the 3 of them hopped off, Ben, Olivia, and this mystery man. Guy Wallace says he had a bad feeling, so he asks them, "You guys sure you're okay?" I mean, presumably the creepy comments had kind of alerted him. But he says they reply, "Yep, no worries, fine." It was about 4 a.m. by this time, although there would be a lot of debate about the timings that things happened that night, which, you can understand. It was New Year's Eve, people were drinking, it was very late, no one's, completely clocking the time. So, as you can see, a lot of what-ifs. And look, this is obviously not meant to push any responsibility onto any of those people for what would eventually happen. That's all on the killer.
Let's take a quick break.
So, those what-ifs, the things that could have been different when Ben and Olivia were trying to find somewhere different for the night. Let's recap them.
What if Ben's friend, who had offered them a ride to Ponga Cove, had come back to the Tamarack and they'd all safely got to the beach? What if there weren't so many people on board the Tamarack, so they could have just stayed there? What if there had been 3 young people in the water taxi, Ben, Olivia, and Kirsty, instead of just the 2? Would that have changed the dynamic for the mystery man and put him off? What if Guy Wallace had trusted his gut about the couple's safety and said, no, come on.
So this was the scenario in the early hours of New Year's Day 1998. Ben Smart and Olivia Hope, desperate for somewhere to crash for the remainder of the night, they've been dropped off at a yacht by water taxi driver Guy Wallace in the company of an apparently helpful, if creepy, mystery man. Given that there are witnesses to this critical last known sighting of the pair, and given that those witnesses were squeezed up with this guy on a water taxi, a 3.8 metre inflatable dinghy with a small outboard motor, you'd think it would be an easy case to crack, right? Well, let's go through the water taxi witnesses. We'll come back to Guy Wallace because he becomes the most important witness in the whole case, and there's a lot to get through with him. Now, remember we said Olivia's sister Amelia and her friend Rick were on the water taxi when it came to the Tamarack, when those two got off with Olivia and Ben got on and
swapped,
stuff. Yeah, when they swapped. So what's Amelia's evidence?
So Amelia says that she and her friend Rick left the party, headed to the jetty to get a ride back to the Tamarack. This is around 3:20 a.m. They were soon joined by another couple, we'll get to them, and the water taxi driver, Guy Wallace. So Amelia and Rick, Guy Wallace, and this other couple, they jump into the water taxi, and Guy starts the outboard motor. Just before they've left, though, a lone man, a guy on his own, hopped in as well and sat opposite Amelia.
And this is the guy. This is the mystery man. So what did she see?
You can imagine she's gone over and over and over this, but unfortunately the answer's just not much. Amelia says there was a spotlight on the jetty, but she didn't even really get to see the man's face before they're motored off into the dark towards the Tamarack, and then, so they're in the dark. As best she could remember, he was in his late 20s to early 30s. She did recall one specific thing, which the prosecution would later consider crucial. The man had short hair receding on his temples. But beyond that, she couldn't even remember what he was wearing. So not much of a description, really. And you can understand why. It was dark. There was no particular reason at this point for her to fix this dude in her memory. Just this guy jumped onto this busy water taxi, and it was very, very late. Rick, who was with Amelia, he remembers even less. In his first statement, he says he doesn't remember anyone else on the water taxi apart from Amelia and the driver. So he's like 3 people short. And then a few days later, he's asked about the mystery man, and he says he must have been pretty quiet because I can't recall him being on the water taxi. He told police, quote, "That's about all I can say, unfortunately." So Rick didn't even remember the other couple on the water taxi. So who were they?
So their names were Hayden and Sarah, boyfriend and girlfriend. They'd come down to the jetty with Guy Wallace towards the water taxi, and they were still on the water taxi when Amelia and her friend Rick disembarked and got on the Tamarack, switching with Ben and Olivia. And they are still on the water taxi for that journey from the Tamarack to the mystery man's boat.
Right, so they're there sort of from start to finish.
Yeah, they see the whole thing. So along with Guy Wallace, these are the last 2 people to have seen Ben and Olivia get on board this man's mystery yacht. This mystery man's yacht, sorry. What's a mystery yacht?
Yeah. Mysteries everywhere.
The mystery man with the mystery yacht. As to what the mystery man looked like, they were fairly vague too. 5 foot 8 inches, which is 1.7 metres, 1.72 metres tall in proper change. Said he was aged about 25 to 35, and they said brown wavy hair. They said they didn't even see enough of his face to tell if he was shaven or unshaven. So a few details, but not very fruitful. However, when it came to describing the boat Ben and Olivia and the mystery man got onto, Hayden was very clear indeed. And Sarah didn't have any recollection of it apart from one detail. We'll come back to the yacht because the description of the boat really is one of the most contentious pieces of evidence in the case, and it was responsible for introducing non-sailors in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Yes, there are quite a few, despite the fact our main city is known as the City of Sails, to a couple of new words, ketch and sloop.
Right, it's time to focus on that guy, Guy Wallace. Like we said, he was one of the staff at Furneaux Lodge that night, working behind the bar, cleaning up, and also helping out with the water taxi. It was a busy night. 1,500 punters swilling away, dancing, and whatever else people get up to at New Year's.
Singing Wahoo.
Sorry,
what's it called?
Woohoo. It's song number 2, actually.
Song number 2, there we go. Look, as a side note, I was reading some of the trial coverage I wrote as a reporter for the New Zealand Herald back in the day, and I saw that I described 2 witnesses having left the party to, quote, enjoy each other's company.
What a charming phrase.
Yeah.
That's why you got the big bucks at the Herald. Anyway, Guy Wallace was tidying up, picking up some rubbish in the grounds, when Hayden and Sarah asked him if he could drop them at their accommodation. So that's a different batch across the water. Remember, batch, holiday home, crib in the South Island. So
Definitely not a
know the
mess.
rest. The three of them go down to the water taxi. The three of them get in, Hayden, Sarah, Guy Wallace. And then another pair, who happened to be Olivia's sister, Amelia, and her friend Rick, get in. Guy starts the motor. The mystery man trots down the wharf and gets in. They all putter out to the Tamarack. It's only about 200 metres off the jetty, by the way, out to the right, as you're looking out to sea. Amelia and Rick get off. Ben and Olivia get on, that little swapsy. Kirsty gets left behind. They head to the mystery man's yacht. By this stage, the mystery man has invited Ben and Olivia aboard to sleep. Guy's a bit unnerved/worried, but off they get. Water taxi leaves. Guy drops off Hayden and Sarah at their destination. And that's it. Ben and Olivia are never seen again.
Just, by the way, we should clarify exactly where the mystery man's boat was something that is still heavily disputed to this day. No one had GPS, of course. It was the late 90s and GPS was mostly just a military thing. So all the witnesses were relying on memory and recollections in the pitch black on the water late at night. And remember, this was a time when barely anyone had cell phones either, let alone smartphones. So there were far fewer photos and videos taken on the night than you'd expect nowadays, and certainly no GPS tracking of phone movements. Anyway, the next morning, that morning, here we go again, that confusion. New Year's Day, 1998.
Just roll.
Olivia's friends on the Tamarack realise she's not there. But initially, at least, they're not too concerned. They know she's left with Ben. They start a bit of a search for her, but figure she'll be somewhere safe. By January the 2nd, though, when there's still no sign of Ben or Olivia, Gerald Hope, Olivia's dad, goes to the Blenheim police. He tells them Olivia and Ben haven't been seen since being picked up by a water taxi from the Tamarack. A missing persons inquiry is launched. That's all it is at this stage, just a missing persons inquiry. Everyone's hoping for the best.
Yeah.
On Saturday, January the 3rd, after questioning the Furneaux Lodge staff, the police figure out it was Guy Wallace who was driving the water taxi with Ben and Olivia on board. Initially, he was a little bit confused about the trips he'd taken around that time of night, but he had been working about 20 hours by that stage, so that's understandable. Nonetheless, he gave a description of the mystery man.
About 32, about 5'9" tall, wiry build. He was unshaven but didn't have a moustache. He had short, dark, wavy hair and smelled like a bottle of bourbon.
2 days later, when he was interviewed again, he went a little bit further.
He was about 5'8" tall. He's shrunk by an inch. Anyway, wiry build. His hair was a browny colour, wavy and medium length. He had about 2 days' growth on his face.
And again, here comes the booze reference.
He was bourboned up, like his eyes weren't focusing.
Crucially too, Guy Wallace says he didn't remember the mystery man just from that single boat trip. He remembered serving the same guy at the bar during the night. This meant that police were able to ask other people who'd been at the bar if they knew who this man was. By January 6th, the missing persons inquiry had well and truly ramped up. Ben and Olivia hadn't turned up anywhere. And a detective inspector had come up from Christchurch to lead the investigation, Detective Inspector Rob Pope. By the next day, it was officially called a homicide inquiry, codenamed Operation TAM, which was short for Tamarack. As the police started to identify everyone who was at the party, they came across the name Scott Watson. Some cops went around to his house on January the 5th to ask what he knew, but he wasn't there. He was out on his boat. 2 days later, he was back. He went to the police station and was interviewed. A photo was taken of him in the police station. Routine measure in these sorts of inquiries. No big drama. Around this time, though, unbeknownst to him, police were starting to become quite interested in Scott Watson. Exactly why is not clear, but certainly there was nothing linking him directly to the disappearance at this stage anyway. On January 9, so that's, 8 days after they've gone missing, Guy Wallace was shown a photo of Scott Watson, but Guy Wallace, said, don't recognise the bloke. He was told the man's name, Scott Watson. No, doesn't ring any bells. 2 days later, January 11, the police try again. Guy Wallace was shown a montage of 8 full-length photos of men, one of whom was Watson. Again, Guy Wallace said he didn't recognise any of them. This montage was known as Montage A. So a montage is sort of a photo board.
Yeah, right.
It was later claimed that police showed Guy Wallace Montage A again sometime after, but with a different photo of Scott Watson in the lineup, and that, again, he didn't identify Watson as the mystery man. The police had really honed in on Watson by this stage. Detective Inspector Rob Pope said that Watson, quote, stood out like dog's balls, saying he had, quote, the right sort of agenda and pedigree. Nice little dog reference there with the pedigree and the dog's balls anyway. And it's true, Watson had not covered himself in glory throughout his life, or indeed at the party. Actually, it's probably time we should fill in a bit of detail. Who is Scott Watson?
Who is Scott Watson? So Scott Watson was born in June 1971 in Christchurch, the youngest of 3 children to Beverly and Chris. Scott went to primary school in Christchurch, but then the family all went to sea. So brother Tom, who was 6 years older than Scott, he joined the Navy, while Scott and his sister and his parents boarded an 11.5 metre steel cutter. It's a kind of yacht. We're learning so many yacht words today. And it headed off on a 6-year adventure around the coast of New Zealand. They basically cruised around and stopped in different places for casual work. Scott did school by correspondence through that time, but in the 4th form, so that's year 10 and new money for New Zealanders, he was enrolled at Marlborough Boys High as a boarder, but he hated school, gained a reputation for truancy, left on his 15th birthday. So all those boats in his background, he found work on fishing boats, or in boat building yards, but there were signs of trouble. He got into skinhead culture, shaved his head, gave himself tattoos, including one on his hand that said skin. And you've got to wonder, did he run out of space for the second half of the word? But who can say? He was always a loner, never actually joined any skinhead groups or gangs as such. First came to police attention as a teenager after stealing several $100s from a fish and chip shop that his parents were running. So yeah, they called the police to see if they could scare him straight, but clearly didn't really work. By the time he was 26, which was when he was arrested for the murder, he had 48 convictions, mostly for burglary, theft, cannabis offences. There was one assault, that was when he was 16, and there were two convictions for possessing an offensive weapon. Watson had 2 brief times in prison in 1989 and 1990, but mostly in the 8 years up to the time we're talking about, he'd mostly kept his nose clean from 1990 to 98. When I say mostly, one of those offensive weapons convictions was in 1995, and he used a marlinspike to threaten a truck driver in a dispute over his dinghy. And I say marlinspike like I know what it is. What's a marlinspike?
Well, I had to look this up because, and lucky I did, because I'd assumed, a marlinspike was the pointy bit of a marlin.
Obviously.
But it's actually not. It's a tool used at sea to splice and untie knots. So there you go.
I'm sure there's a marlinspike reference with Captain Haddock and Tintin. But anyway, I should have researched that before we actually hit record. So anyway, it's around this time, mid-1990s, the time of the marlinspike, that Scott Watson built his yacht, the Blade. That boat really was his life, his pride and joy. He spent much of his time sailing and up and down the coast. On one of those trips in 1997, he met a woman in Whangarei, Northland. So, yeah, he's getting the whole way up the country. He didn't have many, if any, close friends. So him having a girlfriend was a bit unusual, even though she'd get seasick, but she'd still go sailing with him and hang out. But they broke up in late 1997. So, yeah, it didn't last super long. Apparently, Scott became jealous because she was dancing with some guy at a party. He sailed south again, back to Picton. So that's top of the South Island, pretty much. Back to Picton, where his parents were living. And so now this brings us to just a few weeks before the New Year's Eve at Furneaux Lodge. So at the Furneaux Lodge party, Scott Watson told people that he was on the lookout for, quote, babes, and he was hitting on numerous women. To one of them he said, "Come down onto my boat. I'll do things to you have never imagined or dreamed of." There was a boatie there with his girlfriend, and Scott said to the man, "Give her to me, mate. I'll look after her, and I'll show her a good time." So Creepy,
Yeah.
yes, most definitely.
Definitely.
The chilling words of a killer, rather. I'm pretty sure worse has been said out on the town most Friday nights. Not that I'd know because I'm too old to go out anymore, but also clearly not condoning what he said, but people say stupid shit when they're out drinking.
They do. Anyway, within 2 weeks of Ben and Olivia's disappearance, the police had sort of, as we've said, zeroed in on Scott Watson, and the cops were keen to find out if Guy Wallace recognised Scott Watson as the mystery man from the water taxi and the bloke he'd served that night at the bar. But by the end of the month, with enormous public pressure mounting, they still hadn't connected those two dots, despite showing Guy Wallace a couple of photos of Scott Watson. By then, Watson was his name was getting out in the media as the prime suspect, and a television journalist made an attempt to get Guy Wallace to say if Watson was the mystery man. This TVNZ reporter showed Guy Wallace footage of Watson walking down the street and asked if he was the man on the water taxi, and Guy Wallace said no. So at least 3 attempts, to join the dots, and 3 noes from Guy Wallace. But everything changed on April 20, 1998, 4 months after the disappearance.
And this is huge, this moment, because Guy Wallace was shown another group of head and shoulders photos, or photos which are head and shoulders. The others were full length, weren't they? And this one's known as Montage B. Scott Watson was one of the men in the montage, but the photo of him was unusual. We'll get to that. But anyway, this time, Guy Wallace picked Watson's photo out, though he still wasn't super emphatic. This is what he said.
I believe photograph number 3 is the person who was in the bar and on the boat with me. At the time, however, he had good growth on his chin and face. He had a more unkempt look. His hair had more length to it and was more bushy and wavy.
And let's just to be clear, when Guy Wallace just there talks about photograph number 3, he's talking about the third photo number 3 in Montage B. Anyway, he went on to say,
it's the eyes of the person in photograph number 3 that stand out for me more than anything.
Now, remember in his second interview, Guy Wallace had said of the mystery man, he was bourboned up, like his eyes weren't focusing. And this particular picture of Scott Watson, what's unusual about it, this one in Montage B, it was to become known as the blink photo because Watson's eyes were half closed, like he'd been photographed mid-blink. There's another mugshot of him that was taken that same day when he's not blinking. And when you look at the two together, it's like they're different people. But once Guy Wallace made the connection between photograph 3 and Montage B and the mystery man, bingo, well, that's a breakthrough. That's the thing the police have been seeking. And it was even more significant because of another development police had made a couple of weeks beforehand. Combined together, things were about to really ramp up in the case against Scott Watson.
But we're going to come back to what happened in our next episode. So for now, thank you for listening. Long Story Short is a Te Pūrongo production. I'm Eugene Bingham and he's Adam Dudding.
And over in the corner is Connor Scott, who is producing, editing and wrangling us. Thank you to my old mate Anton Morgan, who wrote theme music, to Phil Johnson, who designed the awesome Long Story Short artwork and logo, and also infinite thank yous to the many, many journalists who year after year just keep reporting what's happening with this case.
We're on all the usual podcast platforms and also on YouTube and everywhere else. So please subscribe, give us a 5-star rating, and maybe even write a review. And we will see you with the next episode of Long Story Short soon.
Bye.